The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh basil as Jake stepped into his backyard garden. He inhaled deeply, relishing the quiet before the world fully woke. This was his favorite part of the day, the moment when the garden belonged entirely to him. The neat rows of tomatoes glistened with dew, their deep red hues a testament to months of careful tending. His cucumbers stretched along their trellis, plump and ready for harvest. It was a small oasis, a labor of love that had transformed his once barren yard into a lush retreat. But something was wrong. Jake's brow furrowed as he moved closer. His steps slowed, scanning the beds with growing unease. Tomatoes were missing. Not just one or two, whole clusters had vanished overnight. His cucumbers, which had been hanging in abundance the evening before, were gone. He knelt down, running his fingers over the damp soil. Someone had trampled through his garden. A faint trail of footprints led toward the fence that separated his yard from his neighbor's. Jake's stomach tightened. He already had a sinking suspicion about who was responsible. Rising to his feet, he peered over the wooden panels, and his suspicions solidified into certainty. Karen. She was in her yard, humming to herself as she transferred a bundle of fresh produce into a reusable grocery bag. His produce. Tomatoes, cucumbers, bell peppers, all carefully plucked and now sitting in her tote as if she'd just returned from a farmer's market. Jake took a breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Confrontation wasn't his first instinct. He preferred rational conversations over shouting matches, but this was blatant theft. He leaned against the fence and called out, keeping his voice measured. "Morning, Karen. I couldn't help but notice some of my vegetables are missing." She didn't even flinch. With a casual glance over her shoulder, she gave him a breezy smile. "Oh, good morning, Jake. I just grabbed a few. They looked so ripe and I figured you wouldn't mind." A few. She had nearly half his harvest in that bag. Jake's fingers tightened on the wooden fence, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "I actually do mind. I put a lot of work into growing these." Karen laughed, a dismissive chuckle that sent a spike of irritation through him. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just vegetables. You have so many, why should it matter?" Jake exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "That's not the point. If you wanted some, you could have asked." Karen waved a hand as if swatting away his concerns. "Jake, you're young, healthy, and obviously have a green thumb. You'll grow more. Besides, I'm just helping out. Think of it as sharing with the neighborhood." His jaw clenched. He wasn't running a community garden. This wasn't some unspoken agreement where neighbors helped themselves. She had taken without asking, without even pretending to respect his effort. Sharing implies both people agree, Karen. This is stealing. The word should have landed with weight, but Karen only gave him an exaggerated sigh, as if he were being unreasonable. "Oh, lighten up. It's not like I emptied your whole garden. You're making a fuss over nothing." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but she was already walking away, disappearing through her back door as if their conversation had been nothing more than idle chit-chat. Frustration knotted in his chest. He had expected at least some acknowledgement of wrongdoing, maybe an embarrassed apology, but Karen wasn't the type to feel guilty. She had taken what she wanted and dismissed his concerns without a second thought. He turned back to his garden, surveying the damage. His morning harvest was gone, and with it, his good mood. This wasn't something he could just brush off. He had spent months tending to this garden, adjusting soil pH, warding off pests, watering and pruning daily. It wasn't just about the vegetables, it was about the effort, the care, the principle of it all. He thought about putting up a sign, something passive but firm. "Private garden, do not pick." But Karen wasn't the kind of person who respected boundaries, written or otherwise. Maybe cameras. If he caught her in the act, she wouldn't be able to deny it. Then again, she wasn't denying it now, she just didn't care. Jake took one last look at the fence before heading inside. He needed to think. Karen had taken from him without hesitation, without remorse. The question wasn't whether she would do it again. The question was what he was going to do about it. Jake had hoped that confronting Karen would be enough to make her stop, but deep down he knew better. Some people only understood boundaries when they were physically enforced, and Karen didn't seem to recognize the concept of personal property unless it was her own. Still, he gave it a few days, watching his garden with quiet wariness, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she had gotten the message. Then, on a bright Saturday morning, he caught her red-handed. From his kitchen window, he saw her crouched near his cucumber vines, wearing gardening gloves as if she were some benevolent caretaker rather than a thief. A woven basket sat beside her, already half filled with his vegetables. She moved with practiced ease, plucking what she wanted without a moment's hesitation. Jake felt his pulse quicken. The sheer audacity of it made his head spin. It was one thing to take without asking. It was another to double down after being confronted. He stepped outside, making no effort to be quiet this time. The gate swung shut behind him with a sharp clang. Karen. She glanced up, completely unfazed, and smiled. Oh hey there, Jake. Just grabbing a few more cucumbers. Yours grow so much better than mine. He crossed his arms, the weight of his frustration settling heavily in his chest. That's because I actually take care of them. Karen chuckled, undeterred. Well, lucky for me you have such a generous heart. He stepped closer, his patience wearing thinner by the second. No, Karen, lucky for you I haven't called the police. That finally made her pause, her smug expression slipping just slightly. But only for a moment. Then she let out an exaggerated sigh, standing up and dusting off her gloves. Oh come on. You wouldn't actually do that. We're neighbors. Besides, it's not like I'm taking all of them. Jake ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly through his nose. That's not how this works. You don't just get to decide what's okay to take from someone else. Karen tilted her head as if considering his words for the first time, then shrugged. Well, if you feel that strongly about it, maybe you should put up a fence or something. Out of sight, out of mind. The flippancy of it was staggering. She had no remorse, no shame, just an endless supply of excuses to justify her entitlement. Jake stared at her, half expecting some hint of a joke, some sign that she was messing with him. But there was nothing. Just that same self-satisfied smirk. She picked up her basket and turned toward her house, moving at her usual unbothered pace. As she reached her back door, she called out over her shoulder, "Thanks for sharing, neighbor." Jake stood frozen in place, fingers curled into fists at his sides. This wasn't going to stop. It wasn't just about vegetables anymore. It was about respect, or the complete lack of it. Karen wasn't just stealing from him, she was mocking him while doing it, daring him to push back harder. And the worst part? She genuinely believed she had the right to take whatever she wanted. He took the rest of the day to cool down, forcing himself to think rationally instead of acting on anger. He could install cameras, but Karen was too brazen to care about evidence. He could go to the HOA, but they'd probably write it off as a petty neighbor dispute. Then, as he scrolled through his phone that evening, an idea struck him. A slow smile crept across his face. Karen wanted to pretend she was shopping at some free farmer's market? Fine. He'd give her the full experience. Jake spent the next few days preparing, his frustration fueling his determination. If Karen wanted to play games, he'd make sure she lost. It was time to introduce her to a concept she seemed unfamiliar with: consequences. The first step was simple. He printed out a handwritten note on thick, elegant stationery, the kind that exuded professionalism. Then, he carefully taped it to one of the wooden stakes in his garden, right where Karen would see it the next time she came prowling. The message was polite, almost cheerful. Dear valued customer. Thank you for shopping at Jake's Organic Market. We appreciate your business. Below is your invoice for this week's harvest. Tomatoes, $3 each. Cucumbers, $2 each. Bell peppers, $4 each. Total due, $56.00. Payment accepted via Venmo, PayPal, or cash. Late fees apply. We look forward to serving you again. Have a blessed day. Jake could hardly contain his amusement as he stepped back and admired his work. If Karen wanted to act like she was casually grocery shopping, she might as well start paying for the privilege. Sure enough, the next morning he heard a loud, indignant shriek from across the fence. Are you kidding me? He took his time stepping outside, feigning casual curiosity. Karen was standing in his garden, the note clutched in one manicured hand, her face twisted in disbelief. Oh, good morning, Karen, he said pleasantly. I see you found your invoice. She gaped at him. What the hell is this? Jake crossed his arms, keeping his expression neutral. That's just a courtesy notice. Since you've been helping yourself to my produce so regularly, I figured I'd start charging standard organic market prices. Karen's jaw tightened. This is insane. You can't charge me for vegetables from your own garden. Why not? He tilted his head. Farmers charge for their crops. Grocery stores charge for produce. I don't see why I should be the exception. Her face reddened. Because we're neighbors. You can't just start acting like some business and expect me to pay for a couple of cucumbers. Jake let out a slow, measured breath. Karen, you've been stealing from me for weeks. If you didn't want to pay, maybe you should have asked permission before taking what isn't yours. She scoffed, waving the note like it was personally offensive. Oh, come on. It's not like I took that much. Jake arched a brow. $56 worth says otherwise. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again, her fingers tightening around the paper. He could see the wheels turning in her head, grasping for an argument that would make her the victim. When none came, she switched tactics. I'm not paying this, she snapped, crossing her arms. That's fine, Jake said easily. There's a 10% late fee for missed payments though, so I'd suggest handling it sooner rather than later. Karen let out a strangled noise of disbelief. You are out of your mind. Maybe, he admitted, shrugging. But at least I'm not the one committing petty theft in broad daylight. Karen stormed off, muttering under her breath, but Jake wasn't worried. He hadn't expected her to pay up. That wasn't the real goal here. The real goal was to get under her skin, to make her feel the sting of being held accountable for once in her life. And judging by the way she stomped into her house, it was working. But Jake wasn't done. That evening he took it a step further. He snapped a picture of Karen's latest shopping trip. A shot of her strolling through his garden, basket in hand, looking every bit the satisfied customer. Then he posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group with a simple caption. Asterisk, for those of you enjoying Karen's homegrown veggies at the last neighborhood barbecue, just letting you know they were actually grown in my backyard. She's been shopping for free, but don't worry, I've started billing her at standard organic market prices. Asterisk. He hit post and sat back waiting. The reaction was immediate. Comments poured in within minutes. Asterisk, wait, she's been stealing from you this whole time? Asterisk. Asterisk, oh, please tell me she actually got an invoice. Asterisk. Asterisk, so that's why she suddenly became a gardening expert. Asterisk. Asterisk, I'd pay good money to see her face when she reads this. Asterisk. By the time Jake checked back an hour later, the post had over 100 reactions and was spreading fast. The neighborhood was loving it. Karen, on the other hand, was not. That night, as Jake sat on his porch sipping a well-earned beer, he saw her blinds twitch. Then her back door opened and she stepped out, phone clutched in one hand, face tight with barely contained fury. Even from across the fence, he could hear the tension in her voice. Asterisk, take down that post, asterisk. Jake took a slow sip of his drink before answering. What? Is something I said incorrect? Karen's fingers clenched around her phone. You're making me look bad. I'm not making you look like anything, he said, setting his beer down. I just posted the truth. If that happens to make you look bad, well, maybe that says something. She exhaled sharply through her nose, her face twisting like she'd bitten into something sour. You have no idea how embarrassing this is for me. Good, Jake said, meeting her glare head-on. Now imagine how frustrating it's been to have you take from me every week without a second thought. She stared at him for a long moment, breathing heavily. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed back inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Jake leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Finally, she understood. The next morning, Jake woke to an unusual silence. No rustling in the garden, no casual humming from the other side of the fence. Karen was quiet. That was a first. He stepped outside with his coffee, surveying his plants with cautious optimism. Everything was exactly as he had left it. Not a single tomato out of place. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe it was over. That she had finally learned her lesson. Then he saw it. A crumpled envelope taped sloppily to his garden gate. Jake sighed, already bracing himself for whatever nonsense Karen had cooked up. He peeled it off and unfolded the note inside. Asterisk. You have made this entire situation unnecessarily hostile. I was just trying to be neighborly, but clearly, you don't understand generosity. Since you insist on acting like some kind of businessman, I've taken the liberty of submitting a complaint to the HOA about your unsanctioned agricultural activity. Let's see how much you enjoy your little hobby once they get involved. Cheers. Asterisk. Jake let out a low whistle. So this was her next move. Petty. Predictable. Pathetic. A lesser man might have worried, but Jake knew how these things worked. His garden was completely within HOA guidelines. He had spent years making sure of it. Karen, on the other hand, had a track record of complaints against her. Loud parties, unauthorized renovations, even a parking dispute that had nearly gotten her fined. If she wanted to escalate, she had chosen the wrong battlefield. Still, Jake wasn't about to just wait for the HOA to dismiss her complaint. If Karen wanted a war, he'd give her one. That afternoon he made a few calls. Within hours he had a plan. The next day Karen returned home to an unusual sight. A large wooden sign stood proudly at the edge of Jake's garden. Its bold lettering, painted in vibrant green, was impossible to miss. Jake's Organic Market, now open. Below it, a neat price list was posted for all to see, along with a smaller note. Asterisk, per HOA guidelines, all produce is grown for personal and community enjoyment. Neighbors are welcome to support local gardening efforts through fair compensation. Unauthorized harvesting will be treated as theft and reported accordingly. Asterisk. To top it off, a small chalkboard sign by the gate read, "Ask about our premium pricing for repeat customers." The timing couldn't have been better. That weekend, the neighborhood was hosting a community yard sale, which meant more foot traffic than usual. Curious residents stopped by, laughing as they read the signs, some even asking if they could actually buy produce. Jake happily handed out fresh cucumbers and tomatoes, accepting small payments with a wink. Karen meanwhile was trapped. Jake saw her peeking through her blinds, no doubt fuming as neighbor after neighbor strolled past, all in on the joke. The very same community she had hoped would turn against him was now celebrating his ingenuity. Then came the real cherry on top. That afternoon the HOA representative arrived, not to reprimand Jake, but to issue a warning to Karen. As it turned out, her complaint had backfired spectacularly. Not only was Jake's garden fully compliant, but her history of unauthorized property alterations had drawn fresh scrutiny. The HOA had done a surprise inspection of her yard, finding multiple violations, including an unapproved storage shed and a fence extension that encroached on shared property lines. Karen had gone looking for a fight and ended up bringing a spotlight onto her own mess. Jake watched from his porch as the HOA rep handed her a formal notice, listing her infractions in painful detail. She tried to argue, her voice sharp and desperate, but it was useless. The rules were the rules. When the rep finally left, Karen turned to face him. For the first time she looked truly defeated. Not just embarrassed, asterisk cornered star. Jake met her gaze, expression calm, coffee cup in hand. He didn't need to gloat. The satisfaction was in the silence. Karen clenched her jaw, her hands balling into fists at her sides. Then without a word she marched inside and slammed the door. She never touched his garden again.